My name's Tim Schneider. I am here because about 2-3 months ago, Lucia and the Talking Galleries team reached out to me to ask if I would do a presentation on blockchain and art. Now, this is a subject that I spent a lot of time reading about, thinking about, writing about over the course of the past year, and I have opinions about it. So the deal that I struck with them is that I would be happy to talk about blockchain and art, but one of the things that I think is really important to note, or one of the things I've concluded, is that there has been so much attention paid to blockchain over the course of the past year that some other technologies that are really exciting and actually have use cases that are already out there just aren't getting any attention at all. So I want to kind of split the time up and talk first about blockchain, what I've learned, what I think it's good for, what I don't think it's good for, and then get into some of these other things, some of which Jaja nodded to in the previous talk. So, personal history of art and blockchain. Basically, I didn't know anything at all about this subject about 14 months ago, give or take. And then by the end of 2017, Bitcoin, which is the one blockchain use case that everyone knows something about, or at least has heard of, became so unavoidable that I decided I had to just kind of immerse myself in the technology and learn what was actually going on. So at the beginning of 2018, I started this 3-part series that I ran at ArtNet News, where I'm a staff writer. And the first piece in the series was just an explainer. Basically, what is blockchain? So we'll return to this in a second, but just to kind of give you the broader context, the second piece in the series was about the way that artists are using blockchain to actually make works. And then the third part in the series, which we'll get into in more depth as well, is like the business use cases in the arts for blockchain, or at least the potential business uses. So having all that context, that leads to the question, what the hell is a blockchain? Now, to really explain this in depth, which I've now done on stage 3 different times, I can tell you that if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the technology, I would need 3 things. 1, I would need this graphic. 2, I would need about 7.5 solid minutes of your time. And 3, I would need a drink, because it is painful. It is really difficult to explain this technology to people who aren't already at least a little bit versed in it. So, because I think some of the larger issues around blockchain are more worth talking about than some of the nitty-gritty technical stuff, what I'm going to do instead is just kind of give you a very basic overview. So, back to the question of what is blockchain, I think there are sort of 3 key components here. First and foremost, blockchain is just a database. What you're doing with the technology is tracking information. You will often see when you're reading articles about blockchain, people will use the phrase a digital ledger. And again, that's all it's referring to. All you're doing is tracking information. The second important point about it is that it is decentralized. Now, what decentralized means is that instead of a case where you have a set of information that's being guarded by one particular central authority, whether it's a federal government, whether it is a financial institution like a bank, that sort of necessarily makes you vulnerable to either something catastrophic happening to that one central authority, or that one central authority doing things with your assets that you don't want them to do. So one of the appeals of blockchain is the idea that you're not siloing it with one entity. You're instead spreading out this record of information across many different computers. And in a lot of cases, they are not anywhere near each other geographically. They're not owned by the same person. The only thing that they have in relationship to one another is that they are all tracking the same set of information. The last point is that blockchain is encrypted. It is an encrypted database, which means that anytime you want to update this database, you need a computer to essentially crack a very complex mathematical problem. This is where the whole crypto prefix comes from. It's all from encryption and cryptography, which is what you use to actually update blockchain. So that's kind of the most basic I can make it. Now, in terms of what you can use blockchain for in the arts, these are right now kind of the 3 main use cases you see for it. Number 1 is cryptocurrencies, which, again, Bitcoin being the prime example, there are others. But cryptocurrencies are essentially borderless money. They are money that is not minted by any particular central government. They're not subject to any particular set of laws. We can come back to some of the implications of that later. The second use case is artwork title registries, which are basically public databases of provenance. And we don't have these in the art world right now. They do have them in other industries that people like to invest in, for instance, real estate or cars. You can find title registries for individual assets in those areas very easily. They're public record. We don't have that in the arts. In theory, blockchain is something that people think can lead us to that kind of end game. The third is kind of an abstract concept. It's called smart contracts. Smart contracts are essentially automated legal agreements. The idea is that you can write a contract that you will no longer need a lawyer to make sure is executed properly. Weirdly enough, the best explanation I have ever found to help make a smart contract real is if anyone has ever seen Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. There's a point late in the plot where it's revealed that Russia, which is in the Cold War with the US at this point, has developed this thing called the Doomsday Machine. The Doomsday Machine is a nuclear apparatus that ensures that if the US were to strike Russia first, even if the entire Russian government and military apparatus was wiped out, Russia would still be able to strike back, because what would happen is that they have this doomsday device, which is designed to trigger itself automatically under a specific and clearly defined set of circumstances programmed into a gigantic complex of computers. This is basically a smart contract. It's like an apocalyptic smart contract. But that's the basic idea. Now, I should say before we move on that the main thing that people talk about using smart contracts for is artists' resale rights. As a result, if you combine all these things together, the kind of blockchain promised land is that we will have access to many new wealthy buyers who are all rich with cryptocurrency, making them one of my favorite terms in this entire weird ecosystem, the crypto wealthy. We'll also have unprecedented market transparency, courtesy of these public provenance databases that we don't have. And we'll also have a new level of fairness and ease, especially for artists, again, by using smart contracts, especially to ensure that they get artists' resale rights. All of this sounds really appealing, doesn't it? So in that sense, maybe it's not surprising that the art world basically went crazy for it. This is just a small sample of blockchain and art events that happened last year. In May, there was this auction at a Tech World blockchain summit called the Ethereal Summit. There were $190,000 worth of blockchain-based artworks that went off there. And by the end of the year, I'm not going to go through everything, but by the end of the year, you had a panel on art and blockchain at Art Basel Miami Beach, which was the second art and blockchain conference that Art Basel had run that year. The first was in June. I moderated that one. At NADA Miami, you had a talk series, which was entirely about blockchain and art, sponsored by a blockchain art platform called Snark.art, and you had 4 separate art and blockchain conferences happening in Florida simultaneously that week. This is a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff about a technology that I spent a lot of time dealing with. At the beginning, I was really excited about it. In January of 2018, I was kind of this guy. I was young, I was fresh-faced, I was optimistic. I was like, man, this is really going to be cool. 12 months later, I was this guy. I was haggard. I was beaten down. I was like, I don't know if any of this stuff really works. Now, there's a guy named Vint Cerf who is regarded as one of the founders or fathers of the internet for reasons we don't have to go into, but he's somebody that people in the tech industry generally will regard as kind of a sage. And there was a point last year where he was doing a talk on blockchain, and he very helpfully created a flowchart that will tell you when you need a blockchain and when you don't. And after a lot of time spent in the art world, I decided that it's pretty easy to adapt his flowchart to the art world. So if you want a very simple reference, this is it. You might want to get your cameras ready. I'm not going to leave it up forever, but it will be there. Okay, so of course, any flowchart has a central question. That central question is, do you need a blockchain or not? That's the flowchart. So why do I feel this way? Let's go back to the blockchain promised land. So again, the idea is access to many new wealthy buyers using cryptocurrency, unprecedented market transparency, and a new level of fairness and ease, especially for artists. When you get into the weeds of what these things actually do, here are the problems kind of going backwards. Smart contracts are great in principle. The problem is that they only apply to things that are digital. The moment you move out of the digital world into the physical world, they are basically useless. Consider the idea of buying a house with a blockchain-based smart contract. If I show up on move-in day, having bought this house with a smart contract, and the previous owner has barricaded themselves inside with an arsenal and says, I'm not leaving, the blockchain is not going to help me. Artwork title registries, which in principle I think are a great idea, I have issues with those too, because after really talking to a bunch of people who are trying to run these things, and while I will preface this by saying that I think a lot of people working in this space really do have the best intentions, they are really trying. But what I found with the artwork title registries is that they're essentially not doing anything remotely resembling what blockchain is supposed to do, which is create a system where you don't have to rely on a central authority to trust what's happening. Instead, the way that these things basically work is that you have a startup that wants to be a blockchain database for provenance, and they go to collectors who, up to this point, as we all know, have not been particularly willing to just come out and tell you anything about what's in their collections. It's very secretly guarded information for good reason. And they're saying, okay, what we'll do is we will vet the thing for you, and we'll make sure that the public, unless you want to divulge your own identity, the public won't have to know who you are. But we'll tell them that everything is okay. This doesn't strike me as being particularly transparent. Kind of strikes me as the opposite, which then leads us into the whole problem with cryptocurrencies, which are unregulated money. The idea that we are going to usher in a new era of transparency in the art world by using a currency that one gallery owner, who I will not name here, but she went on a BBC podcast and explained that the reason that she had decided to get involved with cryptocurrencies and start accepting them was because they were trying to establish relationships with collectors in places like China and Russia, where it's frankly illegal to move a bunch of money out of the country. Thankfully, with cryptocurrencies, we can do this. So does this really sound like a really super transparent progressive art market? I kind of feel like it doesn't. In fact, it sort of calls to mind one of my all-time favorite art world quotes from the one and only Jeff Koons. I sometimes take a helicopter to travel to my farm, but I don't live a luxurious lifestyle. I don't know. Here's my issue. Ultimately, this goes back to the sort of people having their best intentions involved in the blockchain world. I think that people really want to solve these problems. The issue is that the problems that they're trying to solve are not technological problems. They're behavioral problems. The idea that we need blockchain to track the provenance of an artwork is, I think, misguided. And you can see it in the comps that people use to say, oh, this is a great idea, because they'll say, again, we have title registries in real estate and we have title registries in the car market, but we didn't need the blockchain to do either of those things. We just needed people to say, oh, this is a good idea. I'm going to volunteer information. We're going to just make this thing happen. If we're asking the art world to play by different rules, and different rules that make people or give people the opportunity to be more secretive with what they do, I don't think that that's pointing us in the right direction personally. And again, cryptocurrencies, same kind of thing. Like, well, I mean, that's pretty obvious. The smart contracts, I think, are another interesting example, because we don't need, technically speaking, any kind of software to enforce artists' resale rights. Just to give you one example, there's a famous artists' resale rights contract that was written in 1971 by Seth Siegelov and Robert Projansky. That's been around now for almost 50 years. Practically no one uses it, but it's not because it doesn't work in theory. It's because just people don't seem to be interested. So I'm highly skeptical of the idea that blockchain is going to solve all these problems that are ultimately just choices that people in the art market are making about what to prioritize and what not to prioritize. In fact, in my kind of most extreme moments, I would say that blockchain is basically a cop-out for making bigger, scarier changes to the art trade. It's allowing us the fantasy of saying that we can change the way that the business works without having to change the way that we work. And we can get all these benefits without really having to sacrifice anything in the process. And I think that that's a little dubious. All of which then begs the question, okay, well, what else is out there technologically that is maybe interesting at this point? And I consciously made the decision that I'm going to try to focus on some of the sexier things that are happening as opposed to some of the more basic operational things like, for instance, cybersecurity, which is something that I think galleries should pay attention to, but it's probably not something that you want to hear about in depth at 5:15 on a Monday afternoon. So let's talk about virtual reality. Now, virtual reality is something that, again, Jaja touched on very briefly already. Most of you in the audience probably have some concept of it, just so we're all working from the same basic rule set. We can define virtual reality basically as a fully immersive 360-degree software environment. So when you're in a virtual reality environment, you are basically shut out entirely of the physical world. That's why you are wearing goggles like that. You usually have headphones. In some cases, you have joysticks with you. And all of this stuff is, in the really high-end versions, being run off of a pretty serious kind of desktop computer rig. Now, virtual reality is actually already being used in an art context in some fairly interesting ways that may have implications for galleries. One potential use case is the idea of virtual walkthroughs of traditional exhibitions. Now, the image that's up here is for the Kramer collection. Now, the Kramer collection is an actual physical collection that exists. It's 74 17th century Dutch and Flemish masterworks that are owned by a couple named George and Ilona Kramer. They started collecting in 1994. The collection is now swelled to kind of dozens and dozens of works, as I said, and up until recently, they had mostly been sharing those works by loaning them out to institutions, which is admirable and useful, but also kind of necessarily limits your reach. So apparently what the Kramers were doing was they were thinking, well, we'd like to really get more people in, we'd like to get more exposure for the collection. They considered the possibility of creating their own physical private museum, and then they decided that they weren't going to do that. What they did instead was that they worked with their son, who's in tech, and an architect from Daniel Liebeskin's studio to digitize their collection and create a virtual space in which it could hang in. So when I say digitize their collection, I don't just mean that they went and they shot like 2 photos of each work and moved on. They shot between 2,500 and 3,500 photos of each piece so that they could create super, super specific digitized versions that could exist in 3D. And then once those versions existed, they worked with the architect to create this virtual space. So anybody with a virtual reality headset can now walk into the Kramer collection and tour it just like they could tour a regular museum. Now, this is, I think, a fairly interesting proposition. Obviously, it's also a situation where galleries are, I think, increasingly having a hard time getting a high number of people to come into their space because there's so much travel, because there are so many other obligations. And if you really want to give someone an up-close and personal view of something, no matter how good your kind of static installation shots are, there's only so much you can do. And even like a video walkthrough that you shoot is only going to do so much. The prospect that you could create an entirely rendered virtual space for it and that they could jump into at any point and kind of really wander around has an appeal, certainly. There's also an even more extreme version of this, which opens up even kind of broader business propositions. So this is an institution called DIMODA, which is an acronym for the Digital Museum of Digital Art, which sounds redundant at first, but actually isn't. So like the Kramer collection, it is a completely virtual space. The difference is that the artworks shown in DIMODA are strictly virtual reality works. So the organization goes out and commissions digital artists to create virtual reality works that are then only shown in DIMODA. So you have basically an entirely virtual art experience that is out there that people can access. And you can support it just like you would support a normal institution. And this opens up the possibility of something that I call staytronage, which is stay-at-home patronage. So instead of the idea of saying like, oh, we can kind of get somewhat of an idea of what it would be like to go to MoMA or the Whitney or whatever if those places created virtual reality experiences, like this way you can visit the actual thing by going in, and it's like it's a completely virtual reality environment. So that's also, I think, potentially an exciting thing. At the same time, as with anything else, there are obstacles to VR. Now, it may not shock you to hear that I'm ultimately kind of a VR skeptic. One problem is the equipment. So the equipment is not super, super expensive, but it's not super cheap either. Like to get a really high-end VR setup, you're basically going to cost yourself a few $1,000s, which to people who buy high-end art is not a big deal. But the issue is that it's something that you have to go out and ask people to buy and ask people to learn and ask people to dedicate themselves to. And similar to what Jaja was saying about how you go out and you can, if you download all of these different individual apps, ultimately you may use them once and then never again. It's kind of a similar thing, except it's just a much more expensive proposition to go out and like buy a dedicated set of virtual reality hardware for the sake of a few virtual reality experiences. For instance, I talked to a collector who made his money in tech and who has really tried to be kind of at the forefront of collecting in virtual reality. And he said that he owns 6 or 7 virtual reality works. And I asked him, how many times do you actually go in and use them? And his answer was 0. That gives me pause. There's also this issue of the isolation effect. Again, as Jaja touched on briefly, one of the things that we're seeing in terms of the types of artworks that people want to see or the types of experiences that they want to have more generally, right now, people are willing to spend money on experiences, and especially communal experiences. So things like music festivals, things like major exhibitions or art fairs or whatever else. It's the idea of being able to spend time with people on kind of like an event basis. And VR is basically the opposite of that right now. It's again, isolating yourself in a virtual environment, right? There aren't really very many opportunities to have another person in the same space as you. Like there are developers that are working on that, but it's not something that is easily accessible right now. And then the ultimate issue that both of these things feed into is the adoption rate. Basically, how widely and how quickly are people going to get interested in literally buying into VR technology? Now, ostensibly, we're in the golden age of virtual reality. And the golden age of virtual reality happened in June of 2014 when Facebook paid $2 billion to buy Oculus, which is a virtual reality hardware maker. Wired wrote a big cover story about it, and to their credit, they said, look, we really think that this is the turning point in VR. This is going to be the moment where people really start taking it seriously and the general populace really gets involved. At the same time, we have made this prediction before. And they had a little sidebar, and they showed all of the other cover stories where they had previously mentioned the idea that this might be VR's moment. If you're curious, those other cover stories were in June of 2008, August of 2001, November of 1999, August of 1996, and December of 1993. VR has been just about to happen for 26 years. Again, this kind of gives me pause about what we're really talking about here. All right, that leads us to augmented reality. Now, augmented reality is sort of a sister technology to virtual reality. The idea is that you are mixing digital elements with the physical world. That's why it's also referred to as mixed reality sometimes. And people who know about augmented reality usually know about it for one of 2 reasons. The first is Google Glass, which is what you see Prince Charles modeling here. It was a piece of hardware that Google released originally in 2012. It stopped being a consumer product in 2015 because of a variety of reasons, one of which it was inciting just general hatred and actual violence in the Bay Area in certain cases, largely because of privacy concerns. If you saw somebody out on the street and they were wearing Google Glass, there were people who would get concerned that they were being recorded, and this can incite violent reactions in some cases. Also, people who wore Google Glass were actually referred to as glassholes for a while, so that word entered the lexicon. So anyway, Google Glass may come back at some point, but right now it's not happening. So the other augmented reality use case that people know about in the general population is Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go, for anyone who doesn't know, is a sort of app-based game version of the popular kind of kids franchise. The way that Pokemon Go works is that you would download an app, and you can then go out and use your smartphone lens in actual spaces in the physical world, and you could hunt down these digital creatures, which it was your job or duty or ability to catch. And Pokemon Go was a phenomenon. It is still one of the most downloaded apps of all time. When I say it was a phenomenon, it was downloaded 500 million times in 2016, which, I mean, it's stating the obvious, nothing in the art world has ever been that popular. Nothing in almost any space has ever been that popular. This leads us back into art, though, because there are cases where augmented reality is already being used to do things that have an art basis. This is a story that my colleague Sarah Casconi at ArtNet News wrote earlier, I guess almost a year ago at this point, but it's about an augmented reality app that was called Hacking the Heist. And the heist that it refers to is the famous heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. For anyone who doesn't know, that happened in 1990. Thieves impersonated police, broke in, cut 13 works out of their frames, and absconded into the night, and to this day still have not been found. As a matter of fact, there is still a reward out for information leading to the resolution of this case. That reward is $10 million. So if there's anybody in the audience who wants to just leave now and go work on that instead, I will not be offended. But the idea behind hacking the heist was not super dissimilar from what Pokemon Go was doing. Basically, what the developers did was that they created digital renderings of the actual works that used to be in those frames. And if you downloaded the app and you went into the museum, which still has the frames up as kind of like an in memoriam type thing, and you held up your smartphone while running the app, you could actually see the works back in their rightful place. Commercial uses for this same this same technology are also already kind of out there. There are a number of apps that are doing the same thing for the sake of trying to help you figure out whether or not you want to live with a piece of artwork for the rest of your life, or at least until the rest of the time you decide you can't get a better price for it and you sell it. But Saatchi Art is one of the developers or entities that has one of these apps, and the concept is, again, pretty simple. Basically, what you do is you select an artwork from their online store. You go over to a space in your home or office, you scan the space that you're thinking of hanging that work, and then through the magic of augmented reality, you can see a digital rendering of that piece hanging exactly where you want it to hang. And that simplifies a process that gallerists are familiar with, which is the idea of sending out work on approval, which means that for the sake of trying to sell a work, what you will do sometimes is effectively send it to a client so that they can live with it for a limited period of time. This can be done. Sometimes it works. It's also kind of risky, and it's something that I think many galleries would prefer not to have to do if they didn't absolutely have to. So augmented reality, in theory, is something that you could use to resolve that in a different way. If we want to talk about the obstacles for augmented reality, they are fewer than the obstacles for virtual reality, I think. Again, the equipment concerns aren't really there because, as we just saw, in a lot of cases, you're just using the technology you already have, which is your smartphone. The isolation effect isn't there because the entire point is that you are trying to mix the digital world and the physical world. And as a matter of fact, part of the reason that Pokemon Go was such a phenomenon was that you would have people who were friends who would download the app and then go out together and kind of make it a thing that they would do socially. So again, that's a major difference from what VR does. And then obviously the adoption rate is not really an issue if you already have people using technology that they have already and not sort of being asked to silo themselves in their homes so that they can experience whatever it is that you want them to experience. So that really just leaves investment and development. Basically, how much money, how many resources do you want to put into this new thing? And that's obviously an open question right now. Last thing I want to talk about is artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence is, full disclaimer, I will tell you that I wrote an art market predictions for 2019 column a few weeks ago, and one of my predictions was that artificial intelligence will replace blockchain as the single technology that people in the art world can focus on this year. So I'm kind of rigging the game a little bit by talking about it here, but at least I'm being honest about it. Okay, so what does artificial intelligence mean? I think that this is really important to establish because you're going to be hearing about this a lot, I think. If you just ask an average person what their concept of artificial intelligence is, usually the answer that you're going to get is something similar to the idea of a thinking, feeling machine. You basically have software that can learn on its own without direction, that can potentially experience emotions, and is basically an artificial life form. This set of characteristics actually describes something called artificial general intelligence. That's not what we're really talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence in the art world or any other industry right now. Artificial general intelligence is something that we are nowhere near. And in fact, the only people who were really concerned about it are Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and a few other extremely wealthy white guys who have no other concerns in the world to occupy their time. The artificial intelligence that we're talking about instead is synonymous with another term that you'll hear thrown around, which is machine learning. And machine learning gives you a much better sense of what it is that we're really talking about. Machine learning describes basically a development process where you have a piece of software that can do one specific thing, can learn to do one specific thing. And it can learn to do that one specific thing if you have humans feeding it a very specific set of information to train it so that it can then understand on some level what it is that you're trying to do. Obviously, this is all still kind of abstract. So, to frame things a little better, let's talk about where artificial intelligence is already happening in your lives. One use case is autocorrect. So anytime you have ever typed a text or written an email at this point, and the software has told you what you're actually trying to say, whether or not it's right, that is machine learning / artificial intelligence at work. Another simple, familiar use case is Uber route optimization. So anytime you open Uber and you call for a ride, and it tells you that it's figuring out the best route to get you to your destination and selecting the best driver to pick you up, that's all based on machine learning. It's all just historical data used to figure out what to do next. Last simple example, recommendation engines. Anytime you watch a movie on Netflix and it says, since you watched X, you might also like Y, that's machine learning at work. It's the software examining what its customers have already watched and then what they watched next or what they watched previously, and basically using that to figure out what you want before you realize that you want it. This gives us a little bit of a preview of some of the things that artificial intelligence might be useful for in the art world, and in fact is already being used for in some cases. Some of you may have heard of a startup called Arta. Arta is a startup that exists to, in their own telling, apply modern technology to fine art shipping. So there are sort of two different things, or two different ways that Arta can do this. Traditionally, what it has done until very recently is that they basically have a team of experts who you can outsource registrarial duties to. Instead of having to go out and individually email 5 or 6 art shippers to try to figure out what their rate would be for the shipment that you have and when they could get it there, Arta had an online submission form and still has an online submission form that's standardized, and they have a network of vetted art shippers that they already work with, and you would just fill out one form and then let their team kind of handle the rest, and then they would come back to you. If you do it that way, their claim is that they can take the process from 2 weeks, which is what your registrar would be doing on their own, to 9 days, which is already a big, big savings. However, they also recently introduced this other feature called Instant Quote. Instant Quote uses machine learning based on prior shipments data to basically automate the entire process. So you're no longer using their human experts, you're actually just trusting the software. And if you use Instant Quote, their claim is that you can go from 2 weeks to go from the initial request to confirming a shipment to 4 minutes, which is almost unbelievable. But again, in theory, this is what machine learning can do, what artificial intelligence can do. Another use case that's out there is recommendation engines. So last year, Sotheby's, in its quest to continually do more and more things that are not just selling work behind an auction rostrum, they bought a startup called ThreadGenius. ThreadGenius is just a recommendation engine for art and design objects. And the idea here is pretty simple. If you go in and you have some idea of what it is that you're looking for, if you can't get it, or even if you can get it, Sotheby's will be able to offer you other ideas that are based on actual data instead of just what their experts might subjectively think you want. The last and probably most boring case is just art market data analytics. So the idea, obviously, working with data is something that has become very hot in the art market. It's one of the reasons that I have a job, because looking at auction data and trying to find patterns is something that I am paid to do at this point. But if you have machine learning, if you have artificial intelligence kind of working on these same data sets, in theory, you may be able to come up with either new insights or the same insights, but faster and more efficiently than if you were just paying a flesh and blood human to kind of run the same numbers. Now, again, those are all that's the potential. There are issues with artificial intelligence, of course. The first one is that it's a small art world after all. This is a reference to the fact that artificial intelligence runs on data. The more data you have, the better you can train software to do anything. And if you don't have very much data, you're basically not going to be able to come up with anything functional. Now, Sotheby's can use Thread Genius because they are running dozens of auctions every year with hundreds of lots in each one. So they're doing thousands upon thousands of transactions. That's a sufficient amount of data. However, if you're a emerging market gallery or even a modestly sized gallery, you're not going to be able to just take like your art-based sales history and dump it into an algorithm and be told like which collectors you should be offering work to at which prices at which times of year. It's just, there's not enough information to tell you that stuff. If everybody in the industry made all of their sales data public, then maybe we would have something, but I think that the prospects of that happening are pretty low. Second issue with the recommendation engine idea specifically is what nerds like me refer to as brand inelasticity. What this means is that sometimes people don't want something like the thing that they want, they just want the actual thing. To give you an example, if I were to walk into Sotheby's and say, what I really want is a gold Rudolph Stingel on the left-hand side, and they said, well, we can't get you that, but we can get you a silver Jacob Cassay, which is on the right-hand side. It has many of the same characteristics based on what our algorithm is telling us. I'm probably not going to be very happy about that because the point isn't that I want a kind of set of characteristics to hang on my wall. It's that I want a Rudolph Stingel. It's sort of like saying if I got rich, which is already highly unlikely, but if I were to get rich and say I really want to buy a loft in Soho, and a piece of machine learning software told me, well, you can get all the same features at a way better price if you buy a loft in New Jersey instead, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's not the thing that I want. So, by the way, I'm not saying Sotheby's isn't aware of this, and I'm not saying that there aren't cases where some collectors might not be okay with that. I'm just saying that when you especially get into the really high-end level of the market, I think that the uses or the usefulness of this is much more limited. The last thing that I want to talk about, though, is I think the most important of all. I'm going to refer to it as bias preservation. One of the things that tends to get lost when people talk about artificial intelligence is the fact that artificial intelligence only exists because of organic intelligence. Meaning, when we talk about big data, when we talk about algorithms doing things, I think there's a natural tendency to just trust that this information is coming in objectively and that therefore we can trust it because it's all based on data. The problem with that is that when you say that you're trusting an algorithm, what you're actually doing is trusting the person who wrote the algorithm. And people are not objective. People have biases, people have predilections, people have tendencies. Sometimes they're aware of them, sometimes they're not. There is an AI pioneer named Fei-Fei Li, who is now a professor at Stanford, and she summed this up very well. This is a long quote, but I think it's important. So there's nothing artificial about AI. It's inspired by people, it's created by people, and most importantly, it impacts people. With proper guidance, AI will make life better, but without it, the technology stands to widen the wealth divide even further, make tech even more exclusive, and reinforce biases we've spent generations trying to overcome. I would say that all of these things are true in the art market as well. And in fact, there's a great example of this that just happened very recently. This, for anyone who doesn't know, and anyone who fell asleep during Jaja's presentation, which if so, shame on you. This is an artwork titled Portrait of Edmond de Bellamy by a Parisian trio that calls themselves Obvious. It is a piece that was produced with the help of artificial intelligence. Basically, they had an algorithm, which they may or may not have taken as a piece of open source code, but that's a separate issue. But they had an algorithm. They trained it on thousands and thousands of essentially Renaissance portraits and got it to produce the image that you see now. This piece was consigned by Christie's. It had a high estimate of $10,000 in October of last year. It ultimately sold for $432,500. So basically, it went insane. I also went insane, but for entirely separate reasons. This piece infuriates me. And it's not because of the aesthetics, although I certainly don't think that those are anything to write home about. But it drives me crazy because of the things I was just talking about in terms of bias preservation and what people aren't thinking about when it comes to artificial intelligence in art, and I would say technology in art more broadly. So first things first, to go back to this, one of the things that Obvious did was that they convinced Christie's to list the artwork not as being by Obvious, but by being by the algorithm. So if you look in the catalog, the algorithm is listed as the artist. This is nonsense. The algorithm did not create this thing on its own. The algorithm created this thing because 3 specific people fed it a specific set of information. And the specific set of information that they fed it is the second problem with this. There's an artist named Turbo Avedon who pointed this out first, as far as I can tell. Of course, the entire community working on machine learning and predictive analytics and art get beaten to the auction block by this white guy portrait. Obviously, we are now living at a time where the representation of women, of artists of non-white ethnicities, of non-heterosexual orientations has become a big, big topic in art. So the idea that ostensibly this piece, which Christie's also proposed as being the first AI-generated piece of art to come to auction, which isn't even true for reasons we can talk about separately. But the idea that this was the work that the traditional art world now sees as being kind of the standard bearer for this technology is a big, big problem, because it essentially directs art about 300 years back into the past, when a common understanding of it was portraits of aristocratic white people. I don't think that this is a kind of definition of art that we should be particularly keen to accept right now. In fact, the idea that it was such a big deal is the most depressing part of all, because it means that I mean collectively as the art world, effectively took a technology that is extremely progressive and put our trust in people who either don't properly understand it or aren't willing to be transparent about what they're doing. They created something that was incredibly regressive from a thematic standpoint, and we celebrated it. We made it a big thing. This is about as depressing to me from a technological standpoint as if someone had created some kind of technology that allowed you to teleport to other habitable planets, and the only outcome that mattered was the fact that you got rich because people found a place where you could still go and hunt bald eagles. Like, this is not the type of thing that I really want people to be thinking about when it comes to technology and art. And it's sort of a summary, in a way, of a lot of what we've been talking about, even when it comes to blockchain. The point is, what are we thinking about? What are we prioritizing? What are we really talking about when we talk about technology in the art market? Are we just talking about like new cool things that could potentially be used to do, I don't know, something? Or are we saying we're going to really understand what this technology is? We're going to direct it towards specific problems. We're going to think about it ethically. We're going to try to make sure that this thing can be used to actually make this industry a better place than what it was before. I don't see a lot of that happening right now, but I think it's possible. And if it's possible to take this gleaming new technology and apply it to the most ancient changes or the most kind of ancient principles of what art is, then I think that we could end up in a more harmonious future, as symbolized by this slide. But again, that's up to us, and that's something that I think we all have to keep in mind. Thank you.